My name is Sienna. I am 33 years old, and exactly 15 minutes into my father-in-law's lavish 63rd birthday party, he raised his glass and announced to 36 elite guests that my husband had done charity work by marrying a girl with no pedigree. I did not cry. I simply took a sip of my wine and exposed his declined credit cards and his counterfeit luxury watch to the entire room. My husband retaliated by slapping me across the face while his family laughed. What they did not know was that the hand he struck was the exact same hand that had just legally acquired every single one of their assets. Before I tell you how I dismantled their fake empire in a single night, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to teach a toxic family a lesson they will never forget. The crystal chandelier above the dining table caught the light of 36 flickering candles, casting a warm glow over the carefully curated guest list. We were gathered in the formal dining room of the Vance family estate in Buckhead, a sprawling mansion that my father-in-law Reginald treated like a monument to his own greatness. Tonight was his 63rd birthday dinner, and the room was packed with the local black elite. There were real estate developers, local politicians, and board members of various prestigious organizations. Everyone was dressed in custom suits and designer gowns, projecting an image of untouchable wealth and status. I sat quietly near the end of the long mahogany table, wearing a simple silk dress that my mother-in-law Vivian had loudly criticized as looking off the rack the moment I walked through the door. Vivian sat opposite me, her neck draped in diamonds, exchanging smug glances with my sister-in-law Gabrielle. Next to Gabrielle sat her white husband Preston, who was currently swirling his bourbon and explaining his latest venture capital investments to a captive audience of older guests. My husband Julian sat right beside his father at the head of the table, desperately hanging on to every word Reginald spoke. Reginald stood up and tapped his silver fork against his champagne flute. The gentle ringing sound brought the lavish room to an immediate halt. Conversations died down, and all 36 faces turned toward the patriarch of the Vance family. Reginald smoothed the lapels of his velvet dinner jacket and offered a practiced, charismatic smile that he usually reserved for press conferences. Thank you all for gathering here tonight to celebrate another year of life and prosperity. Reginald began, his deep voice carrying easily across the massive room. We have built something incredible in this family. We come from a long line of excellence of proud fraternity brothers, sorority sisters, and graduates from the finest historically black colleges in this nation. We are the standard. We are the legacy. He paused, letting the murmurs of agreement and polite applause wash over him. Then his eyes drifted down the length of the table and locked directly onto me. His smile turned sharp, predatory. Of course, maintaining that standard is not always easy. Reginald continued, his tone shifting into something dangerously casual. Sometimes our children make choices that test our grace. My son Julian, for example. Julian is a brilliant director at his investment fund, a man of exceptional breeding. Yet he chose to do the ultimate act of charity. He brought Sienna into our home. A girl with no legacy, no family backing, and no pedigree. A girl who did not pledge, who does not belong to our circles, and who brings nothing to the Vance name but her mere presence. Let us raise a glass to my son for his endless patience and his charitable heart, and pray he soon realizes that he deserves a wife who can actually elevate his standing. The silence that followed was suffocating. It was not a playful tease or a misunderstood joke. It was a public execution. I looked around the room. Several guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, looking down at their plates. Others, specifically Vivian and Gabrielle, were openly smirking. I turned to look at Julian, my husband of 7 years, expecting him to stand up to defend me, to say absolutely anything. Instead, Julian kept his eyes fixed on his expensive leather shoes, completely silent, shrinking under his father's shadow, just like he always did. I felt the familiar burning sensation in my chest, the urge to shrink away and hide. For 7 years I had endured their passive-aggressive comments about my natural hair, my quiet demeanor, and my refusal to flaunt designer labels. I had let them believe I was just a regular woman from a working-class neighborhood who had gotten lucky. I had hidden my true identity as the sole heir to the Caldwell financial dynasty because I wanted Julian to love me, not for my family's billions. But looking at his cowardly face right now, I realized there was nothing left to salvage. I reached for my wineglass, feeling the cool crystal against my fingers. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the expensive red wine. Then I set the glass down and stood up. I did not shout. I did not cry. I kept my voice perfectly level, ensuring that every single person in that dead silent room could hear me. "That was a beautiful speech, Reginald," I said, offering him a calm, razor-sharp smile. "And I completely agree about maintaining standards. For instance, a man of your profound legacy and wealth should probably make sure his bills are paid before hosting 36 people for a luxury dinner." Reginald's confident smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. "Excuse me," he barked, his voice laced with warning. I smoothed the front of my dress and took a step away from my chair. "I am just saying it is incredibly fortunate that I arrived early today. The catering company was preparing to pack up the king crab legs and the wagyu beef because your exclusive Black American Express card was declined at 2 p.m. I actually had to quietly cover the $15,000 catering bill myself, so your prestigious guests would not have to eat cheese and crackers for your birthday." A collective gasp rippled through the dining room. Whispers erupted instantly. Vivian slammed her hand on the table, her face turning a mottled shade of red. "How dare you lie about us in our own home?" she shrieked. "I am not lying, Vivian," I replied smoothly, keeping my eyes locked on Reginald. "And while we are on the subject of fake presentations, Reginald, you might want to stop gesturing so widely with your left hand. That Patek Philippe Nautilus you are wearing is a fascinating piece. It is a shame the sweeping mechanism on the second hand is stuttering. It is a very common flaw in the counterfeit models bought from that underground dealer in Miami last month. I would know, considering my actual family owns a controlling stake in the authorized distributor you tried to get a line of credit from." The entire room erupted into chaos. The politicians and business partners were now openly staring at Reginald's wrist, their expressions shifting from respect to immediate suspicion. Reginald's face turned a violent shade of purple. The illusion of the great untouchable Vance family was shattering in real time, right in front of their most valuable connections. Julian leaped up from his chair, his face contorted with panic and rage. He stormed down the length of the table toward me, his fists clenched. The man who had been completely silent while his father humiliated me was suddenly full of energy to protect a counterfeit watch and a declined credit card. He reached me before I could take another step. "Shut your mouth right now!" Julian yelled, and without a second of hesitation he swung his arm and slapped me hard across the face. The force of the blow sent me crashing to the floor, my cheek burning with sudden blinding pain. Around the table I heard Vivian and Gabrielle let out sharp, mocking laughs. Preston leaned over, swirling his drink, and told me I really needed to learn my place in high society. I lay on the polished hardwood floor, tasting the metallic tang of blood on my lip. I did not shed a single tear. I slowly sat up, wiped the blood from my mouth, and pulled my cell phone from my pocket. I dialed a number I had not called for a rescue in 10 years. When the deep voice answered on the other end, I spoke clearly. "Dad, please come. Bring the liquidation files." Julian stood over me, scoffing loudly. "Go ahead, call your unemployed father from the slums to come pick up your trash. It will save me the trip." I did not argue. I simply smiled, placed my phone back in my pocket, and sat gracefully on the velvet sofa in the corner to wait, knowing perfectly well that the storm was already on its way. The room was dead silent, except for the soft jazz music still playing from the hidden speakers. 36 pairs of eyes darted between Julian, who was breathing heavily with his fists still clenched, and me sitting perfectly poised on the velvet sofa. Vivian broke the silence. She stepped over the shattered glass of my wine, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood. She looked down at me with absolute disgust. "You really are just a ghetto rat in a silk dress," she sneered. "Julian gave you a life you could never have dreamed of, and this is how you repay us. By trying to embarrass your father-in-law with some fabricated lies. Calling your broke daddy to come get you is the smartest thing you have done all night. I will have the maids bag up your cheap clothes, Gabrielle chimed in, leaning against her husband, Preston. I told you, Julian, you cannot turn a stray dog into a show dog. She has been jealous of this family since day one. Preston, the self-proclaimed venture capitalist from Silicon Valley, who had married into the Vance family a year ago, decided it was his turn to play the wise patriarch. He walked over, swirling his bourbon, looking down his nose at me with that classic white savior condescension I had stomached for entirely too long. Sienna, let me give you some advice, Preston said, using that slow, patronizing tone he reserved exclusively for me. When you marry into high society, you have to learn your place. Reginald has built an empire. Julian manages millions. You do not bite the hand that feeds you just because you feel insecure about your own background. You should apologize to Reginald, maybe beg Julian for forgiveness and learn to respect the natural order of things. I looked at Preston. His tailored suit and perfectly styled hair could not hide the slight nervous twitch in his left eye. I leaned back into the plush cushions of the sofa and crossed my legs. Learn my place, Preston, I asked, keeping my voice dangerously calm. That is fascinating advice coming from you. Speaking of natural orders and empires, how is that highly exclusive Silicon Valley tech incubator project coming along? The one you convinced Reginald to invest $15 million of his company's retirement fund into Preston's hand, jerked, sloshing a few drops of his bourbon onto the expensive Persian rug. The color drained from his face so fast he looked almost translucent. I have no idea what you are talking about. Preston stammered, his voice suddenly lacking its previous authority. Do you not? I tilted my head, ignoring the throbbing pain in my cheek. Because Reginald's board of directors has been asking for the quarterly returns on that $15 million investment for months. You told them the tech market was volatile, but the returns were guaranteed by the end of this quarter. You used lots of big, impressive words to dazzle a room full of older black men who desperately wanted to believe their white son-in-law was a financial genius. But the quarter ends tomorrow, Preston. So I am just curious where the money is. Reginald pushed past Julian, his chest heaving as he glared at me. Do not you dare bring my company's investments into your petty little tantrum. Preston is securing our family's generational wealth. He is managing portfolios you could not even begin to comprehend. Oh, I comprehend them perfectly, Reginald, I said, staring right back at him. In fact, I comprehended them so well that I spent my entire afternoon tracing the exact offshore routing numbers Preston used to funnel your generational wealth out of the country. Shut her up, Julian! Gabrielle shrieked, clutching Preston's arm. She is just trying to deflect because she got caught acting like trash. Julian laughed, a harsh, grating sound. You hear that, Preston? She is threatening us with her imaginary financial knowledge while waiting for her broke daddy's beat-up car to pull into our driveway. It is pathetic. He took a threatening step toward me again, raising his hand. I told you to keep your mouth shut, Sienna. You are done here. Get out of this house before I have security drag you out by your hair. Before Julian could take another step, a deep mechanical rumbling sound vibrated through the floorboards of the dining room. It was a heavy, synchronized growl of massive engines approaching the front of the estate. One of the guests, a local city councilman, was standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the front driveway. He suddenly gasped, stepping back from the glass. Reginald, the councilman, said, his voice trembling. What is going on outside? Julian froze. Reginald frowned and marched over to the windows, pulling aside the heavy silk drapes. Vivian and Gabrielle followed him, their annoyed expressions quickly transforming into sheer panic. I did not need to look out the window to know what they were seeing. 6 black custom-armored Cadillac Escalades had just violently breached the front gates of the Vance estate. They did not stop at the circular driveway. The lead vehicles drove straight up onto Vivian's meticulously manicured front lawn, their heavy tires ruthlessly crushing the imported Dutch tulips she bragged about at every country club luncheon. The SUVs parked in a tight tactical formation right in front of the grand mahogany entrance doors. The sheer aggression of the arrival sent a wave of terror through the dining room. Several guests backed away from the windows, whispering frantically to one another, wondering if they were being raided by federal agents or a cartel. "Who the hell is destroying my lawn?" Vivian screamed, pressing her hands against the glass. "Julian, call the police right now. Tell them we are being attacked." But Julian was speechless. He stared out the window, his jaw hanging open, as the doors of the Escalades swung open simultaneously. 4 men in sharp, tailored suits stepped out first. They carried thick leather briefcases and moved with the cold, calculated precision of corporate assassins. But it was the man who stepped out of the center vehicle that sucked the remaining oxygen out of the room. He wore a bespoke charcoal Brioni suit that cost more than Julian's entire yearly wardrobe budget. His presence commanded absolute, terrifying authority. He did not look like an unemployed man from the slums. He looked like a king arriving to inspect a conquered territory. Reginald stumbled backward from the window, his face suddenly ashen. The fake Patek Philippe on his wrist seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds as he recognized the man walking up his front steps. "Is that?" The city councilman whispered, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Is that Harrison Caldwell?" "No," Reginald muttered, shaking his head in denial. "That is impossible. Vanguard Holdings does not operate in this city. What is Harrison Caldwell doing at my house?" I stood up from the velvet sofa, smoothing down my dress one last time. The pain in my cheek was completely gone, replaced by a cold, searing adrenaline. "He is not here for your house, Reginald," I said calmly, as the heavy front doors of the mansion were violently pushed open. "He is here for his daughter." The room remained suspended in a suffocating quiet, broken only by the clinking of silverware, as some of the more uncomfortable guests pretended to focus on their half-eaten meals. I sat on the emerald green velvet sofa, my back perfectly straight, my hands folded neatly in my lap. The stinging in my cheek had dulled to a warm throb, but I did not reach up to touch it. I let the faint smear of red on my lower lip serve as a testament to the kind of man Julian truly was. He stood a few feet away, chest heaving, looking around the room, as if waiting for applause for putting his wife in her place. Vivian was the first to break the standstill. She glided across the Persian rug, her diamond necklace catching the chandelier light. She stopped right in front of me, looking down her nose with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Look at you!" Vivian sneered, her voice carrying easily across the dining room. "Sitting there like you actually belong among us. I told Reginald from the very beginning that bringing a girl from the wrong side of the tracks into this family would end in disaster. You do not have the breeding for this life, Sienna. You never pledged a proper sorority. You do not come from a legacy family. You show up to my country club dinners wearing your hair in those natural braids instead of presenting yourself with some class. We tried to polish you, but you cannot wash the ghetto off a street rat." I kept my eyes locked on hers, my expression unbothered. "Are you finished, Vivian?" I asked softly. "Because your designer gown is beautiful, but it does not hide the fact that your husband's business is currently hemorrhaging cash while you worry about the texture of my hair." Vivian gasped, taking a dramatic step back. Gabrielle immediately rushed to her mother's side, linking arms with her. Gabrielle wore a smug, triumphant smile. She had always hated me, always viewed my financial independence and quiet confidence as a threat to her spoiled existence. "You are just jealous," Gabrielle spat out, tossing her expensive weave over her shoulder. "You have been jealous of me since the day Julian brought you home. You resent the fact that I was born into wealth, that I attended the best private schools, and that I married a man who actually respects me. Preston treats me like a queen because he is a real man, a brilliant investor who is taking this family's legacy to the next level. You are just bitter because your father is probably sitting in some run-down apartment right now, waiting for you to come home with your tail between your legs." Right on cue, Preston stepped forward to join his wife. He took a slow, deliberate sip from his crystal glass of bourbon, adopting that relaxed, arrogant posture he always used when dealing with my family. He was a white man who had married into a wealthy black family, and he reveled in the role of the financial savior. He loved using corporate jargon to dazzle Reginald, playing on my father-in-law's desperation to be recognized by the white corporate establishment. Preston looked down at me, shaking his head with a condescending sigh. "Sienna, let me give you a piece of advice," he said, his tone dripping with patronizing sympathy. "When you are invited into high society, you have to learn how the ecosystem works. Reginald built an empire from the ground up. Julian manages millions of dollars for high-net-worth clients. I spend my days navigating the complexities of Silicon Valley venture capital. You do not bite the hand that feeds you just because you feel inadequate. You need to apologize to Reginald, beg Julian for forgiveness, and learn your place in the natural order of things." I looked at Preston, taking in his tailored suit and his perfectly styled hair. I let the silence stretch for a few seconds, allowing his arrogant words to hang in the air for all 36 guests to digest. Then I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a predator watching its prey walk willingly into a trap. "Learn my place." "Preston," I asked, keeping my voice dangerously calm and clear. "That is fascinating advice coming from you. Speaking of natural orders and empires, I have a question about your latest venture. How exactly is that highly exclusive Silicon Valley tech incubator project coming along?" Preston's hand twitched. A few drops of his expensive bourbon sloshed over the rim of his glass and landed on his expensive shoes. The color drained from his face so rapidly that he looked almost ill. "I have no idea what you are talking about," Preston stammered, his voice suddenly lacking its previous smooth authority. "Do you not?" I tilted my head, watching a bead of sweat form at his hairline. "Because Reginald's board of directors has been asking for the quarterly returns on that $15 million investment for months. You told them the tech market was experiencing a slight downturn, but the returns were guaranteed by the end of this quarter. You used a lot of impressive buzzwords to dazzle my father-in-law, convincing him to wire $15 million from his company's commercial real estate development fund directly into your so-called incubator." Reginald marched forward, his face flushed with anger. "Keep your mouth shut, Sienna. Do not you dare bring my company's investments into your petty little tantrum. Preston is securing our family's generational wealth. He is managing offshore portfolios you could not even begin to comprehend." "Oh, I comprehend them perfectly, Reginald," I said, shifting my gaze to my father-in-law. "In fact, I comprehended them so well that I spent my entire afternoon tracing the exact offshore routing numbers Preston used. It is funny how a Silicon Valley tech incubator operates exclusively out of shell companies in the Cayman Islands." Preston took a step back, his chest rising and falling rapidly. "She is lying," he practically shouted, looking frantically between Reginald and Julian. "She is just trying to deflect because Julian caught her making a scene. She does not know anything about finance. If I do not know anything about finance, Preston, then you should have no problem explaining why you missed your margin call 2 days ago." I countered, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. I leaned forward slightly, lowering my voice just a fraction to force everyone in the room to lean in to hear me. "The quarter ends tomorrow, Preston. The board is expecting a $15 million principal return plus interest, so I am just curious, where is the money?" Gabrielle looked at her husband, her confident sneer faltering for the first time all night. "Preston, what is she talking about? Where is the money from my father's company?" "Do not listen to this ghetto trash," Julian interrupted, stepping between me and Preston. He pointed a shaking finger at my face. "She is making up lies to tear this family apart. She is waiting for her broke father to show up in a beat-up Honda to take her away." I looked at Julian, observing the sheer terror masking his bravado. I glanced up at the ornate grandfather clock ticking in the corner of the dining room. It had been exactly 14 minutes since I made my phone call. I settled back into the velvet cushions and smoothed my dress. I did not need to say another word. The seed of doubt had been planted. The cracks in their perfect facade were widening into canyons, and my father was exactly 1 minute away. Julian stood frozen, his chest heaving as he stared at me. A low, rhythmic vibration began to pulse through the hardwood floors. Within seconds, it grew into a heavy mechanical growl. Vivian frowned. "What is that noise?" she demanded, looking toward the foyer. "Julian, go tell security to handle whatever truck is lost. I will not have this evening ruined." But Julian did not move. The growl transformed into a deafening roar of engines. The sheer curtains were illuminated by a blinding wash of harsh white headlights. It was a solid wall of intense light slicing through the darkness of the upscale Buckhead neighborhood. I remained perfectly still on the sofa, crossing my legs and smoothing my dress. For 7 years, I had forced myself to shrink to hide my lineage to play the grateful working-class girl rescued by the illustrious Vance family. I had endured their microaggressions, their blatant disrespect, and their need to prove their superiority. Tonight, all of that ended. Outside, the heavy wrought iron security gates of the Vance estate did not just open, they were violently forced back as a convoy of 6 black custom-armored Cadillac Escalades pushed their way onto the property. They did not follow the circular cobblestone driveway. Instead, the lead vehicles drove straight up onto Vivian's meticulously manicured front lawn. The heavy tires ruthlessly crushed the rare imported rose bushes and the delicate Dutch tulips she bragged about at every country club luncheon. The sound of churning mud echoed loudly through the glass windows. Vivian let out a piercing shriek of pure horror, rushing to the window, pressing her hands against the glass. "My garden," she screamed, her voice cracking. "What are they doing? Julian, call the police right now. Tell them we are being attacked." The elite guests, who had just been laughing at me, were now backing away from the windows in panic. The local politicians and prominent business owners spilled expensive champagne, stepping over each other to find cover. They thought they were witnessing a cartel raid or a federal strike team seizing the property. Preston suddenly dropped his confident venture capitalist persona entirely. The white savior of the Vance family suddenly looked like a terrified little boy retreating behind Gabrielle, using his wife as a human shield. "What did you do, Sienna?" he hissed. "Who did you call?" I did not answer him. I just kept my eyes fixed directly on the heavy front doors waiting for him. The 6 armored vehicles parked in a tight tactical formation right at the base of the grand marble steps. The synchronized precision was absolutely terrifying. The heavy doors swung open in perfect unison. 4 men stepped out first. They were definitely not street thugs. They were highly paid corporate fixers, wearing razor-sharp, custom-tailored suits and carrying thick leather briefcases. They moved with the cold, calculated efficiency of men who destroyed corporations for a living. They flanked the center vehicle, standing at attention. Then the driver of the lead Escalade quickly exited and pulled open the rear passenger door. My father, Harrison Caldwell, stepped out into the cool night air. He was 60 years old, but carried himself with the lethal energy of a man half his age. He wore a bespoke charcoal gray Brioni suit that cost more than Julian's entire annual wardrobe budget. He did not look like the struggling blue-collar worker from the slums that the Vance family had imagined him to be. He exuded absolute terrifying authority. This was the quiet, devastating luxury of old money. He did not need flashy logos or fake watches to prove his worth. His mere presence demanded absolute submission. Reginald pushed past his panicking wife and marched toward the window, his face purple with rage. "I am going to have these street thugs arrested and thrown in prison," he bellowed, puffing out his chest. "I am Reginald Vance. Absolutely no one disrespects my property." But as Reginald pressed his face near the glass to get a better look at the man standing on his ruined lawn, the arrogant words died completely in his throat. The color drained from Reginald's face so rapidly that he looked like he might pass out. The fake watch on his wrist seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds as his eyes locked onto my father. One of the guests, a prominent city councilman who had been hiding behind a marble pillar, suddenly gasped. He pulled out his reading glasses and stared out the window, his hands shaking uncontrollably. "Good Lord," the councilman whispered, his voice echoing in the silent room. "Is that Harrison Caldwell?" Julian looked back and forth between the councilman and his father, looking completely bewildered. "Dad, who is Harrison Caldwell?" Julian asked loudly, his voice cracking with fear. "Why are these crazy people destroying our yard?" Reginald did not even answer his son. He was paralyzed, taking staggering steps backward completely away from the window. He was a commercial real estate developer, and anyone who operated at a high level in the East Coast property market knew the mythical name of Harrison Caldwell. He was the ghost in the machine, the apex predator of Vanguard Holdings, a financial titan who could bankrupt entire cities with a single phone call. "No," Reginald muttered, shaking his head in absolute denial as a cold sweat broke out across his forehead. "That is completely impossible. Vanguard Holdings does not operate in this sector. What is Harrison Caldwell doing standing right in my front yard?" I slowly stood up from the velvet sofa, leaving the bloody napkin on the cushion. The throbbing pain in my left cheek was completely gone, replaced by a cold, searing adrenaline that pumped through my veins. "He is not here for your yard, Reginald," I said calmly, my voice slicing through the heavy tension in the room, just as the massive double mahogany doors of the mansion were violently pushed open. "He is here for his daughter." The collective gasp that echoed through the dining room was thick with absolute terror. Reginald stood frozen by the window, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. He stared at me, and then stared at the man walking up his front steps, his brain desperately trying to reject the reality unfolding right in front of him. Harrison Caldwell, the phantom billionaire who controlled half the commercial real estate on the eastern seaboard, was my father. The man they had spent 7 years mocking as a penniless slum dweller was currently casting a shadow so massive it was suffocating every prominent guest in the room. Julian backed away from me, his expensive leather shoes squeaking against the polished hardwood. He looked at his shaking hands, the very hands he had just used to strike the sole heir of the Vanguard Holdings empire. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train, causing his knees to buckle slightly. Vivian was the first to break from the paralysis. She grabbed Reginald by the arm, digging her manicured nails into his velvet jacket. "Reginald, do something," she hissed frantically. "You cannot let these people barge into our home and destroy my garden. Call security immediately and have them thrown out." Reginald shook himself out of his stupor. His pride, a fragile and volatile thing, flared up to mask his sheer panic. He turned to the 2 armed security guards standing near the hallway archway. "Remove this man from my property immediately." Reginald commanded, his voice cracking slightly, but growing louder as he tried to perform for his 36 elite guests. "I do not care who he thinks he is. This is a private residence and he is trespassing. Escort him and his thugs out before I press charges." The 2 security guards took a hesitant step forward, placing their hands on their holsters, but they stopped dead in their tracks. Harrison Caldwell stepped through the shattered front doors, unbothered by the chaos. His 4 corporate fixers moved in absolute synchronization, fanning out across the foyer. They did not draw weapons. They did not shout. The lead fixer simply turned his head and locked eyes with Reginald's security guards, offering a cold, dead stare that promised complete financial and physical ruin. The guards immediately backed away, lowering their hands and staring at the floor. They knew exactly who held the real power in the room. Reginald puffed out his chest, trying to block my father's path to the dining room. "Listen to me, Caldwell." Reginald blustered, his voice booming in a desperate attempt to assert dominance. "I do not know what kind of game your daughter is playing, but you have no jurisdiction here. My company is worth hundreds of millions. I sit on the board of the most prestigious organizations in this city. You cannot just waltz in here and intimidate me." Harrison did not stop walking. He did not blink. He did not even look at Reginald. It was the most devastating display of old money dominance I had ever witnessed. Loud money demands attention, but quiet money simply takes up all the oxygen in the room. Harrison brushed past my father-in-law as if Reginald were nothing more than a piece of cheap furniture blocking the hallway. He walked past the terrified city councilman, past Vivian, who was trembling with rage, and past Gabrielle, who was clutching her husband's arm. Harrison walked straight to the velvet sofa where I was sitting. He stopped right in front of me, looking down at the red mark spreading across my left cheek, and the faint trace of blood on my lower lip. The temperature in the dining room seemed to drop by 10 degrees. The danger radiating from my father was palpable, a quiet, lethal energy that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. He reached out with a gentle hand and tipped my chin up, inspecting the bruise. He did not say a word to me. Instead, he slowly turned his head and locked his cold, dark eyes onto Julian. Julian let out a pathetic whimpering sound, taking another step backward until his back hit the dining table, rattling the crystal glasses. He looked like a cornered animal realizing he was locked in a cage with an apex predator. My father took a slow, deliberate breath, preparing to dismantle my husband, but I gently placed my hand on his tailored sleeve. "I am fine, Dad," I said, my voice steady and clear in the silent room. "I have this completely under control." Harrison looked back at me, his harsh expression softening just for a fraction of a second. He nodded, stepping back to give me the floor. I stood up tall, smoothing out the silk dress that Vivian had called cheap just an hour ago. I did not look at Julian. He was a coward and his reckoning would come soon enough. Instead, I turned my attention to the man who had just told me to learn my place in high society. I raised my hand and signaled to the lead lawyer standing by the doorway. The lawyer marched forward, his expensive dress shoes clicking against the hardwood floor. He carried a thick, heavy leather-bound dossier. He handed it to me with a respectful nod before stepping back into formation. The dossier weighed heavily in my hands, packed with months of forensic accounting and offshore routing data. I walked deliberately past the ruined dining table, stepping over the shattered glass of my wine glass. I marched directly toward Preston. The arrogant white venture capitalist was sweating profusely. His confident Silicon Valley persona had completely evaporated, leaving behind a terrified, desperate grifter. "What are you doing?" Preston stammered, putting his hands up defensively as I approached him. "You are crazy, Sienna. This is insane." I did not slow down. I walked right up into his personal space, invading the comfortable bubble of privilege he had operated in for the past 2 years. I lifted the heavy leather-bound dossier and slammed it violently directly into the center of Preston's chest. He let out a sharp gasp, stumbling backward as his hands instinctively flew up to catch the heavy folder before it hit the ground. "You wanted to talk about navigating the complexities of venture capital, Preston?" I asked, my voice echoing off the walls. "You wanted to teach me how the financial ecosystem works. Well, class is in session. Let us talk about where Reginald's $15 million actually went." Preston clutched the heavy leather folder against his chest as if it were a shield, but his hands were shaking so violently that the thick stack of financial documents began to slip from the binding. I stepped even closer, forcing him to look me directly in the eye. I did not blink. I wanted him to feel the absolute crushing weight of the reality he had just stumbled into. "For 2 years, Preston, you have paraded around this family like you were their ultimate prize. You charmed Reginald with your tailored suits and your endless name-dropping of tech billionaires. You preyed on a very specific, very pathetic vulnerability in this house. The desperate need for proximity to whiteness, to validate their new money status. Reginald welcomed you with open arms and handed you the keys to his kingdom because having a white Silicon Valley venture capitalist son-in-law made him feel like he had finally arrived in the spaces that had locked him out for decades. Meanwhile, they treated me like garbage because my blackness and my supposed poverty reminded them of the very history they were trying to escape." Preston opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. He just stared at my father standing silently behind me, flanked by corporate lawyers who looked ready to dissect him. "Open the folder, Preston," I commanded, my voice slicing through the deadly silence of the dining room. "Or would you prefer I summarize your resume for the esteemed guests gathered here tonight? Because it is quite a fascinating read. You are not a venture capitalist. You do not own a tech incubator. Your real name is not even Preston Hayes. You are a wanted grifter who has been running a mid-tier Ponzi scheme out of a rented co-working space in Palo Alto for the last 5 years." A collective gasp ripped through the room. Reginald stumbled forward, gripping the edge of the dining table, his face a mask of pure horror. "What are you talking about?" He choked out, his voice barely a whisper. "I vetted him myself. I checked his credentials. You checked the fake website he paid someone $500 to build." "Reginald," I replied, not breaking eye contact with Preston. "You were so blinded by your own desperation to sit at the big table that you handed over $15 million from your company retirement fund without conducting a single legitimate forensic audit. You bypassed your own accounting department because Preston convinced you that traditional audits would slow down the tech investment process. He used buzzwords like disruptive innovation and agile equity to rob you blind while you smiled and thanked him for the privilege." "That is a lie," Gabrielle shrieked, suddenly shoving past Vivian to reach her husband. Her designer gown swished loudly as she grabbed Preston by the arm, glaring at me with a hatred so venomous it could have melted glass. "You are a jealous, pathetic liar, Sienna. My husband is a genius. He comes from a wealthy family in Connecticut. He manages portfolios you could not even dream of. You are just trying to ruin my life because you know Julian never loved you and my family always hated you." I turned my gaze to Gabrielle. She was trembling, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the sleeve of Preston and his jacket. She was the golden child, the princess of the Vance family who had never been told no in her entire life. She truly believed her existence elevated her above consequences. "Gabrielle, your husband is currently holding his own arrest warrant," I said, pointing to the folder in Preston and his hands. "He does not come from a wealthy family in Connecticut. He comes from a string of failed startups and angry creditors. He used your father and his $15 million to pay off the initial investors of his previous fraudulent scheme to keep himself out of federal prison. He essentially used your family as a giant ATM machine because you were the easiest targets he had ever met. You were so busy looking down on me that you let a con artist walk right through your front door and dismantle your entire empire." Preston finally found his voice, though it was high-pitched and frantic. "This is defamation," he yelled, looking pleadingly at the politicians and businessmen who were watching the scene unfold with morbid fascination. "She fabricated all of these documents because she is bitter. Reginald, you have to believe me. The money is locked in a secure offshore holding account. It is going to yield a 30% return by next week. You know how these alternative investments work." Reginald looked desperately between me and Preston, the reality of his impending financial ruin warring with his massive ego. He wanted to believe Preston. He needed to believe Preston, because the alternative was admitting that he had been played for a fool by a white man he had worshipped, and that the daughter-in-law he had just publicly humiliated was the one holding the smoking gun. "Do not listen to her, Daddy," Gabrielle cried, running over to Reginald and grabbing his shoulders. "She is just a nobody. She is trying to steal our moment. Preston is going to make us billions. You know he is. Throw her out. Throw her father out. Call the police on them for trespassing." I watched Gabrielle unravel her entire identity wrapped up in the illusion of wealth and superiority. She could not process that the very foundation of her privilege was currently evaporating into thin air. Her husband was a fraud, her father was broke, and the woman she had treated like dirt was the one pulling the strings. "Call the police," I challenged, tilting my head and offering them both a cold, unforgiving smile. "Please, Reginald, call them right now. Hand them the folder Preston is holding. Let the authorities look at the wire transfers, the fake shell companies, and the offshore accounts that mysteriously drained straight into crypto wallets controlled by Russian creditors. Let the police see how the great Reginald Vance allowed his company pension fund to be wiped out by a man who does not even have a valid securities license." Preston dropped the folder. The heavy leather binding hit the hardwood floor with a loud thud, scattering dozens of pages of damning financial evidence across the ruined dining room. He looked wildly at the front doors, then at the windows, measuring his chances of escape. But my father and his corporate fixers had already anticipated his cowardice. Two of them smoothly stepped in front of the archway, blocking the only exit out of the room. "You are not going anywhere, Preston," I said, my voice ringing with absolute finality. Because the $15 million you stole is just the beginning of the tragedy for the Vance family. Gabrielle let out a guttural scream covering her ears, as if that could block out the truth. She sank to her knees right next to the scattered financial documents, sobbing uncontrollably. Reginald grabbed his chest, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic, as the sheer magnitude of his financial collapse began to take hold of his physical body. But the reckoning was far from over. I had dismantled the fake savior of the family, but I had not yet addressed the husband who had allowed it all to happen. Preston stared at the blocked archway, realizing his physical escape was impossible. The sheer panic in his eyes slowly morphed into a desperate cornered aggression. He straightened his tailored jacket, brushing invisible dust off his lapel, as he tried to summon the arrogant venture capitalist persona that had protected him for so long. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. "This is a coordinated corporate attack," Preston shouted, his voice cracking slightly before he forced it into a deeper register. He turned to Reginald, who was still clutching his chest. "Do not listen to her, Reginald. These documents are completely fabricated. Vanguard Holdings is notorious for these aggressive takeover tactics. She is committing corporate espionage and trying to frame me to steal our proprietary technology." I just looked at him, amazed that he was still trying to use meaningless buzzwords to save his life. "I am calling my legal team right now." Preston continued, pulling his phone from his pocket with trembling hands. "I am going to sue you and your father for defamation, Sienna. I will drag you through federal court for this. You are going to rot in a federal prison for forging financial documents and attempting to extort my company." Reginald seemed to cling to Preston and his words like a drowning man grabbing a life preserver. He nodded frantically, his breathing still ragged. "Yes," Reginald stammered, looking at my father with a mixture of terror and misplaced pride. "Preston is right. You cannot just forge banking records. My son-in-law is a legitimate investor. I will destroy you for this, Caldwell." I did not argue with either of them. Arguing with men who were desperately lying to themselves was a waste of breath. Instead, I reached into the pocket of my silk dress and pulled out my cell phone. I swiped across the screen, opening the smart home application that controlled the entire Vance estate. Because Julian had always been too lazy to manage the household technology, he had given me the master administrative access years ago. I tapped the audio control settings, overriding the soft jazz that was still playing through the hidden surround sound speakers in the dining room ceiling. I maximized the volume. "What are you doing?" Vivian demanded, her voice shrill with panic as the music abruptly cut out, leaving a heavy static hum in the air. "I am giving Preston the floor," I said quietly. Since he claims to be such a brilliant venture capitalist, I thought the distinguished guests gathered here tonight might enjoy hearing his latest pitch meeting. I tapped a file on my screen and hit play. The crystal-clear audio filled the massive dining room, echoing off the mahogany walls. The sound of Preston and his voice, panicked and out of breath, blasted through the speakers. "Sergey, listen to me," Preston pleaded on the recording, the background noise indicating he was walking rapidly down a busy street. "You have to give me until the end of the month. The crypto market crashed and the liquidity is gone, but I have a new funding source. I just need 2 more weeks." A heavy, thick, Russian-accented voice replied through the speakers. "You do not have 2 weeks, Preston. You owe us $12 million. If the money is not wired by Friday, we are not just breaking your legs. We are coming for your new wife." "I swear to God I have the money," Preston begged, his recorded voice echoing above the heads of the 36 terrified guests. "I just married into a family of gullible, flashy idiots. They are absolute marks, Sergey. The father-in-law is this arrogant old fool who is so desperate for white corporate validation that he hands over millions without reading a single contract. I already got him to commit $15 million from his commercial real estate fund. They are the dumbest new money trash I have ever seen. They care more about their country club memberships than their balance sheets." The entire dining room stopped breathing. The silence was so profound, you could hear the ice melting in the water glasses. "Just give me a few more days to forge the quarterly statements," Preston and his voice continued whining through the speakers. "I promise you, Sergey, I will bleed the old man dry. I will drain his entire pension fund before they even figure out how to log into the portal. You will have your 12 million, and I will disappear before the holiday weekend. I hit pause, cutting the audio off abruptly. The silence that slammed back into the room was deafening. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and looked at the crowd of local politicians, real estate developers, and fraternity brothers who had spent the last hour praising Reginald and his brilliant white son-in-law. They were all staring at Reginald with profound pity and secondhand embarrassment. The great Reginald Vance, the man who constantly bragged about his elite pedigree and his unmatched business acumen, had just been exposed as an easy mark. His desperate need for proximity to whiteness had cost him his entire empire, and the whole room had just heard the man who robbed him laugh at his stupidity. Gabrielle slowly stood up from the floor where she had been kneeling. Her designer dress was wrinkled, and her face was stained with mascara tears. She looked at Preston. Preston raised his hands, backing away from his wife. "Gabby, sweetheart, listen to me," he stammered, his eyes darting frantically. "That was an AI deepfake. Sienna generated that audio to frame me. You know how crazy technology is these days. You know I love you." Gabrielle did not say a word. She closed the distance between them in 3 rapid steps and swung her arm with every ounce of strength in her body. The slap echoed through the dining room, sounding like a gunshot. It was so forceful that it knocked Preston off balance, sending him crashing into a serving cart. Silverware and porcelain plates clattered to the floor alongside him. "You pathetic lying garbage!" Gabrielle screamed, her voice tearing through her throat. "You used me! You ruined my family!" She lunged at him again, grabbing his expensive suit jacket and tearing the fabric as she hit his chest repeatedly. The corporate fixers standing by the door did not intervene. They simply watched the golden child of the Vance family dismantle the illusion of her perfect marriage. I watched Preston cowering on the floor, shielding his face from his wife and his attacks, but I felt no satisfaction. Preston was a grifter who saw an open door and walked through it. But the real betrayal was not the white con artist stealing from the family. It was the family member who had held the door open for him. I slowly turned my head away from the chaos on the floor and locked my eyes onto my husband. Julian was standing perfectly still, pressed against the dining table, looking like a man waiting for the executioner to call his name. Because Julian knew that Preston could not have bypassed the company accounting department all by himself. Julian knew that I possessed the rest of the liquidation files, and Julian knew his turn had finally come. Reginald's breathing grew ragged and shallow. He clutched his chest, his fingers bunching the fabric of his velvet dinner jacket as he stumbled against the edge of the mahogany table. The sheer magnitude of losing $15 million was physically breaking him down. He looked at the shattered plates on the floor, then at Preston, who was bleeding from the scratches Gabrielle had just inflicted, and finally turned his desperate eyes toward his son. Julian Reginald wheezed, his voice lacking all of its previous booming authority. "Call the police. Call the FBI. Do not let that piece of white trash leave this room. I want him arrested for fraud right now." Everyone turned to look at Julian. As a director at an investment fund and the supposed heir to the Vance empire, this was the moment he was supposed to step up and defend his family's honor. Instead, he stood entirely frozen. A thick sheen of sweat coated his forehead, practically dripping down his temples. His expensive smartphone was clutched so tightly in his right hand that his knuckles were white, yet he made absolutely no move to unlock the screen. He was shaking his eyes, darting frantically between Preston, who was slowly pulling himself up from the floor, and me standing completely composed just a few feet away. I took a slow, deliberate step toward him. The sound of my heels on the hardwood floor was the only noise cutting through the heavy silence of the dining room. I walked right into his personal space, closing the distance until I was standing exactly where I had been when he swung his arm and struck my face just 20 minutes earlier. The faint metallic taste of blood was still on my tongue, but I felt nothing but absolute power. "Did you not hear your father, Julian?" I asked, keeping my voice soft but laced with lethal intent. "He gave you a direct order. Call the authorities. Have the man who just robbed your family blind hauled away in handcuffs." Julian swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He could not meet my eyes. He looked down at the floor, his breathing coming in short, panicked gasps. "Sienna, please," he whispered, the sound so pathetic it almost made me laugh. "Just stop. You have made your point. You brought your father here. You ruined the party. Let us just handle this privately." "Handle what privately?" I tilted my head, feigning innocence. "A $15 million federal crime. That seems like a matter for the authorities. Unless, of course, calling the police is the absolute last thing you want to do right now." I stepped even closer, lowering my voice so only the people immediately surrounding us could hear the poison dripping from my words. "Aren't you going to call the cops, Julian? Or are you afraid he'll expose your little arrangement?" From the floor, Preston let out a wet, hacking cough that morphed into a desperate, manic laugh. He wiped the blood from a scratch on his cheek, leaving a red smear across his pale skin. The venture capitalist facade was completely dead, replaced by the cornered rat he truly was. If he was going to drown, he was absolutely going to pull someone down with him. "Oh, he is not going to call anyone." "Reginald," Preston sneered, struggling to his feet while keeping a safe distance from Gabrielle. "Your golden boy here would rather cut off his own hand than dial for help." Reginald leaned heavily against the table, his face ashen. "What are you talking about, you lying parasite? Julian, dial the police right now. Prove this criminal wrong." But Julian just squeezed his eyes shut and let out a broken sob. The 36 elite guests who had watched this family parade their wealth and superiority all evening were now witnessing the complete and total unraveling of the Vance patriarch's only son. The contrast between Julian's aggressive posturing when he slapped me and his current cowardly trembling was entirely pathetic. For 7 years, Julian had played the role of the perfect son. He had stood by silently while his mother mocked my clothes and my natural hair. He had agreed with his father when Reginald called my career a cute little hobby. Julian had built his entire identity on being the superior, educated man who had graciously lowered his standards to marry me. He demanded submission and gratitude every single day of our marriage, conditioning me to believe that without the Vance name, I was nothing. He let me endure their daily emotional abuse because it made him feel powerful by comparison. I looked at the man I had shared a bed with for nearly a decade and felt absolutely no sympathy, no anger, no sorrow, just a cold, clinical need to finish the demolition. "Tell them, Julian," I commanded, my voice carrying the same terrifying authority that my father radiated from the doorway. "Tell your father why your phone feels too heavy to lift. Tell him why the director of an investment fund, a man who supposedly checks every decimal point of his clients' portfolios, somehow completely missed the glaring, amateurish discrepancies in his own brother-in-law's fake corporate filings." Vivian, who had been clutching the edge of a dining chair, finally found her voice. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at me. "What lies are you trying to spin now, you vindictive little snake?" she hissed, her perfectly styled hair now slightly disheveled. "Julian is an executive. He has a master's degree in finance from a prestigious university. He would never involve himself in anything illegal. You are just trying to drag him down into the mud with you because you know your marriage is over." I did not even bother to look at Vivian. My eyes remained locked on my husband, watching him sweat under the crushing weight of his own secrets. "Your mother is waiting for an explanation, Julian," I said softly. "Are you going to let her continue defending your honor? Or are you going to tell her the truth about how her brilliant executive son operates behind closed doors?" The guests in the room were completely captivated by the unfolding disaster. The local politicians who had previously sought Reginald's campaign contributions were now quietly stepping toward the exits, wanting to distance themselves from the impending fallout. Harrison Caldwell, my father, simply watched the scene with cold, detached satisfaction. His 4 corporate lawyers stood perfectly still, clutching their briefcases, containing the exact documents that would destroy Julian's entire life. My father did not need to intervene because he knew I had been sharpening this exact blade for months. Julian finally looked up at me, tears spilling over his eyelashes. "Sienna, I am begging you. Do not do this. If you ever loved me, you will keep your mouth shut. I reached up and gently touched the swelling bruise on my left cheek. You lost the right to beg for my silence the moment you put your hands on me to protect a thief, I said smoothly. But since you seem to have lost your voice, I would be more than happy to present the financial disclosures myself. Julian let out another pathetic sob, shaking his head back and forth. It was supposed to be a temporary loan, he whispered, his voice breaking as he stared at the ruined hardwood floor. It was just supposed to float the accounts until the next quarter. Preston barked out a cruel laugh, leaning against the wall. A loan, he mocked loudly. Do not try to sanitize it now, Julian. You sold out your own father to keep your little secret safe. Tell them what you took. Reginald's eyes widened in horror, his breathing becoming even more erratic. Julian, what is he talking about? What did you take? I stepped back, giving Julian the floor, allowing the unbearable silence to press down on him. The facade of the powerful, wealthy Vance family was completely stripped away, leaving nothing but a room full of cowards and thieves turning on each other to save their own skins. I turned my back on Preston, who was still bleeding on the hardwood floor, and focused entirely on the man I had married. Julian was leaning heavily against the edge of the dining table, his breathing shallow and rapid. He looked like a cornered animal, realizing there was absolutely nowhere left to run. I held out my hand, and one of my father's corporate lawyers stepped forward, placing a single thin red folder into my palm. Unlike the massive dossier I had thrown at Preston, this folder was incredibly light. It only contained 3 sheets of paper, but those 3 sheets were about to destroy Julian's entire existence. I walked up to him, stopping mere inches away. I could smell the stale alcohol on his breath and the sour scent of fear radiating from his pores. Tell them, Julian, I said, my voice low and dangerous. Tell your father exactly what you discovered 8 months ago, when you conducted the internal audit of the commercial real estate fund. Julian shook his head frantically, his eyes pleading with me. Sienna, please do not do this, he begged, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. I am your husband. We can fix this. I was trying to protect the family. I was trying to protect my father. Protect your father, I repeated, letting out a sharp, humorless laugh that echoed through the silent room. That is a fascinating way to describe taking a $2 million bribe to look the other way while a con artist drained the company pension fund. Reginald let out a strangled gasp, clutching the back of a dining chair for support. A bribe? Reginald managed to choke out, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. Julian, what is she talking about? I opened the red folder and pulled out the top sheet of paper, holding it up for everyone to see. 8 months ago, Julian noticed a massive discrepancy in the offshore routing accounts, I explained, turning to address the room at large. He confronted Preston about the missing funds. Preston panicked because he knew if Julian went to Reginald, the entire Ponzi scheme would collapse. So Preston offered Julian a deal. I did not. Julian yelled, his voice cracking as tears streamed down his face. She is making this up, Dad. She forged these documents just like Preston said. She hates us. From his spot on the floor, Preston let out a dark, malicious chuckle. Oh, do not try to play the innocent victim now, Julian. Preston sneered, wiping blood from his chin. You were practically salivating when I offered you the cash. You told me you were tired of waiting for your father to retire so you could take over the fund. You said he was a dinosaur who did not understand modern finance. Reginald looked like he had been physically struck. He stared at his only son, the boy he had groomed to take over the Vance empire. You took money from him? Reginald asked, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and profound heartbreak. You let him steal from our family, from our employees. He did not just let him steal Reginald, I interjected, handing the first sheet of paper directly to my father-in-law. He actively helped him cover it up. That document shows a wire transfer of exactly $2 million routed from one of Preston's shell companies in the Cayman Islands directly into a private account controlled exclusively by Julian. The date on that transfer is exactly 8 months ago. Julian fell to his knees, grasping at his father's velvet jacket. Dad, I swear I was going to put it back. Julian sobbed, his perfectly styled facade completely ruined. I was going to use the money to make aggressive trades and earn back the missing 15 million before the end of the fiscal year. I was trying to be the financial genius you always wanted me to be. I wanted to save the company and prove that I was ready to be the CEO. You were not trying to save anything, Julian, I said, stepping back from him in disgust. You took the blood money, and in exchange you used your executive clearance to doctor the family company ledgers. You created fake quarterly reports and authorized forged dividend statements to keep the board of directors completely in the dark. You became an active accomplice in the embezzlement of your own father's legacy. The 36 elite guests erupted into chaotic whispers. Several men who were investors in Reginald's company began pulling out their phones, frantically dialing their own financial advisors. The room was descending into absolute panic as the reality of the situation set in. The Vance family was not just broke, they were going to be indicted for massive corporate fraud. I looked down at Julian, who was still sobbing on the floor. For 7 years he had demanded my submission. He had allowed his family to treat me like a disposable accessory because it fed his fragile ego. He slapped me tonight because he thought I was a helpless working-class girl who would just swallow the abuse and stay quiet. He thought his wealth and his title made him untouchable. You sold your own father out for $2 million, Julian, I said, my voice carrying over the panicked murmurs of the crowd. You sat at this table and watched your mother humiliate me. You watched your sister mock me, and you let your fraudulent brother-in-law lecture me about high society, all while you knew you were nothing but a common thief. You let them call me a ghetto rat while you were the one stealing from your own blood. Julian buried his face in his hands, unable to form a coherent sentence. His entire identity as the superior educated black elite executive was completely shattered. He was exposed as a coward who had sold his family's future for a quick payout. I turned to the guests who were now actively backing toward the foyer, wanting no part of the impending federal investigation. They had arrived tonight to celebrate a titan of industry, and instead they were watching the total dismantling of a corrupt dynasty. My father, Harrison Caldwell, stood by the shattered doorway, watching my execution of Julian with quiet pride. He had raised me to be a predator in the financial world, to spot weakness and exploit it without mercy. Julian had mistaken my silence for stupidity. He had mistaken my grace for weakness. Now he was paying the ultimate price for his arrogant assumptions. I took a deep breath, letting the sweet taste of absolute victory wash over me, but the night was far from over. Vivian pushed her way past the stunned politicians and business owners, her diamond necklace glittering mockingly against her chest as she rushed to defend her broken son. She dropped to her knees beside Julian on the hardwood floor, wrapping her arms around his trembling shoulders. She glared up at me with a hatred that could have burned down the entire mansion. You are a monster, Sienna, Vivian hissed, her voice echoing in the silent room. You orchestrated this entire spectacle to destroy my boy. Julian made a mistake, but he did it to save this family. He took that money because he was trying to inject liquidity back into his father's firm. He was trying to protect Reginald's legacy from that white trash grifter over there. He is a good son who made a desperate choice under immense pressure. He was trying to save the company. Reginald, who was still clutching his chest, looked down at his wife and son. A tiny spark of desperate hope flickered in his eyes. He wanted to believe Vivian. He wanted to believe that his golden boy had committed a felony out of loyalty to the Vance empire rather than pure greed. Is that true? Julian, Reginald asked, his voice cracking with emotion. Were you trying to fix the accounts? Were you trying to save my life's work? Julian kept his face buried in his hands, letting out a pathetic whimpering sound, but he nodded his head up and down. Yes, Dad, he choked out. I was trying to save us. I let out a soft, genuine laugh that cut straight through the heavy air of the dining room. I looked at my mother-in-law, whose manicured hands were desperately clinging to her son's tailored jacket. You really will construct any narrative to keep your golden boy on a pedestal. Will you not, Vivian? I said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward them. For 7 years, you have blamed me for everything wrong in this marriage. You blamed me for not fitting into your elite circles, for not being elegant enough, and most importantly, for not giving you a grandson to carry on the Vance legacy. I paced slowly around the shattered porcelain on the floor, making sure every guest in the room was hanging on to my every word. Do you remember last Christmas, Vivian? You stood in this exact room and loudly suggested to your country club friends that Julian should find a woman whose womb was not as barren as her bank account. You said a Vance man needed a male heir to carry on the empire and that I was a defective investment. You let me sit there and absorb your cruelty while your son poured you another glass of champagne. Vivian lifted her chin defiantly. I only spoke the truth, she snapped. You failed to perform your most basic duty as a wife. I stopped pacing and turned to face her. I raised my hand and my father's second corporate lawyer stepped forward. He did not hand me a thick dossier. He handed me a sleek black folder containing a single glossy brochure and a deed of trust. I casually flipped the folder open. Julian did not use that $2 million to save the company, Vivian. I said, my voice carrying a lethal calm. He did not invest a single dime of that hush money back into the commercial real estate fund. Instead, he wired the entire amount directly to an escrow account to purchase a luxury penthouse in Midtown Atlanta in cash. Vivian blinked, her mouth opening and closing as the information failed to compute. A penthouse, she whispered, looking down at her son. Julian, what is she talking about? I did not give Julian a chance to formulate another lie. He bought it for a woman named Maya. I continued, holding up the deed of trust. She is a 24-year-old bottle service girl he met at a club downtown. And the most exciting part, Vivian, she is currently 6 months pregnant, with a boy. The collective gasp from the 36 elite guests was so loud it sounded like all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. The politicians who had been inching toward the door froze in their tracks, completely captivated by the grotesque unraveling of the city's most prominent family. Vivian let go of Julian, as if his skin had suddenly caught fire. She scrambled backward on the floor, her designer gown tangling around her legs. Her face contorted in absolute horror. A bottle service girl. Vivian gasped, her voice trembling with revulsion. You took $2 million of your father's stolen money to buy a house for a streetwalker. Julian reached out for his mother, but she slapped his hand away with a violent shriek. Do not touch me, she screamed. You stole from your own family to fund a secret life with a tramp. I looked down at the man who had demanded my submission for 7 years. You sold out your father's life work to fund your double life, Julian. I said, my voice completely devoid of sympathy. You let your mother berate me for our fertility struggles, making me feel like a broken woman. You let me endure invasive medical tests and hormone treatments, knowing perfectly well that the reason we were not conceiving was because you were spending your nights across town building a new family with stolen money. Julian was completely shattered. The facade of the brilliant, loyal investment fund director was entirely gone. He collapsed onto his side, curling into the fetal position on the hardwood floor. He sobbed uncontrollably, a pathetic, broken man who had just lost the backing of the only people who had ever tolerated his arrogance. He had no money, no prestige, and now he did not even have the delusional protection of his mother. I watched Julian curl tighter into himself, weeping into the polished wood. The elite guests whispered furiously among themselves. The city councilman was already typing rapidly on his phone, likely drafting a statement to distance his political campaign from Reginald's fraudulent enterprise. Gabrielle, who was still sitting on the floor near Preston, stared at her brother with an expression of pure disgust. The Golden siblings, who had spent their entire lives competing for their father's approval, had both brought catastrophic ruin to the family name in the exact same night. Julian looked up at me, his face red and swollen with tears. I am sorry, Sienna. He choked out, his voice barely audible over the murmurs of the crowd. I am so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. I just felt so trapped by my father's expectations. I stared down at him, feeling absolutely nothing. You were not trapped, Julian, I replied smoothly. You were greedy. You wanted the prestige of the Vance name, the millions from Preston's fraud, and the perfect little secret family on the side. You thought you were untouchable. But the problem with building an empire on a foundation of lies is that it only takes one person to tell the truth and the whole thing comes crashing down. Reginald could not take it anymore. The sight of his son groveling at my feet, the realization of the massive financial theft, and the sheer public humiliation shattered the last remnants of his sanity. He turned his furious bloodshot eyes away from Julian and locked them directly onto me, preparing to unleash the final desperate attack of a ruined man. But before Reginald could redirect his fury toward me, his gaze snapped back down to the pathetic figure of his son, weeping on the hardwood floor. The sheer magnitude of Julian and his betrayal overrode every ounce of paternal instinct Reginald had left. His golden boy, his chosen successor, had not only allowed a white grifter to steal $15 million, but had actively participated in the cover-up to fund a secret life with a bottle service girl. The pristine Vance legacy that Reginald had spent 4 decades building was currently bleeding out on his custom Persian rug. Reginald let out a primal sound that was half roar, half agonizing gasp. He lunged forward, grabbing Julian by the lapels of his expensive dinner jacket and hauled him halfway off the floor. Julian let out a startled cry, reaching up to grab his father and his wrists, but Reginald was completely consumed by a blind, narcissistic rage. With a violent jerk, Reginald ripped his son forward and then swung his heavy hand, striking Julian directly across the face. The sound of the slap was sharp and sickeningly loud, echoing off the high ceilings of the dining room, with absolute perfect symmetry to the blow Julian had delivered to me just half an hour earlier. It was instant, undeniable karma. Julian crashed back down onto the floor, clutching his jaw, his eyes wide with shock and betrayal. Vivian screamed, covering her mouth with her trembling hands, but she did not step forward to help him. The revelation of the pregnant mistress had completely severed her blind loyalty. "You disgust me!" Reginald spat out his chest, heaving as he stood over his trembling son. "You are a weak, pathetic excuse for a man. I gave you everything. I handed you the keys to a kingdom, and you sold me out for a cheap thrill and $2 million. You are no longer my son. You are nothing to me." Julian sobbed openly, curling away from his father, completely broken and abandoned by the very people he had spent his entire life trying to impress. But Reginald was not finished. The slap had temporarily released his pent-up aggression, but he was still acutely aware of the 36 elite guests watching his public unraveling. His ego, a massive and fragile construct, could not accept defeat. He needed a scapegoat. He needed to reassert his dominance and prove to the local politicians and business owners in the room that he was still the apex predator. He could not accept that a woman he viewed as entirely beneath him had orchestrated this masterclass in destruction. Reginald slowly turned his back on Julian and locked his furious, bloodshot eyes onto me. He straightened his velvet jacket, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow as he tried to summon the commanding presence of a commercial real estate titan. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face, his jaw locked in pure, unadulterated hatred. "Do not stand there looking so triumphant, Sienna," Reginald growled, his voice vibrating with desperate arrogance. "You think you have destroyed me tonight. You think exposing my worthless son and that white trash grifter somehow puts you on my level? You are absolutely delusional. I did not move a single muscle. I simply tilted my head and let him continue his pathetic flailing. Even if I lost $15 million tonight, I am still Reginald Vance," he shouted, sweeping his arm across the lavish dining room as if presenting his kingdom to the terrified guests. "This house alone is worth $10 million. My commercial real estate company is valued at hundreds of millions. I own half the high-rises in the downtown district. A $15 million loss is a drop in the bucket for a man of my resources. It is a minor inconvenience that my legal team will resolve by the end of the fiscal year. I have survived market crashes, recessions, and ruthless competitors. I built this legacy with my bare hands, and no jealous little girl from the wrong side of the tracks is going to tear it down. He took a step toward me, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me, just like his son had tried to do. His expensive cologne could not mask the sharp, acrid smell of his own mounting terror. You think handing out a few banking records makes you a financial genius? Reginald sneered, his upper lip curling in disgust. You are nothing but a lowly accountant who stumbled onto some unsecured files. You probably spent the last 6 months snooping through Julian and his home office out of pure, petty jealousy. You do not understand how real wealth works. You do not understand corporate leverage or high-level acquisitions. You are just a bitter, working-class girl throwing a tantrum because your husband finally realized he made a mistake marrying so far beneath his station and sought out a woman who actually respects him. The guests remained completely silent, but I could see a few of them shifting uncomfortably. They recognized the desperate ranting of a man who was bleeding to death but refusing to admit he had been cut. The local politicians and investors who had spent the evening kissing his ring were now looking at him with thinly veiled pity. Reginald was trying to use his booming voice to tape his shattered empire back together, playing the role of the untouchable titan while standing in the wreckage of his own living room. I am not going to let a ghetto rat dictate the narrative in my own home, Reginald continued, his voice rising to a fever pitch. I am going to have my security throw you and your father out onto the street. I am going to ensure that you never work in finance in this city again. I will blacklist your name across every firm on the East Coast. When I am done with you, Sienna, you will be begging for a job ringing up groceries. He pointed his finger toward the shattered mahogany front doors, where my father and his corporate fixers were standing in calm silence. Get out of my house! Reginald roared, the veins bulging in his neck. Take your broke father and your fake lawyers and get off my property before I have you all arrested for corporate espionage and trespassing. You are entirely out of your league, little girl. I stood perfectly still, letting his desperate insults wash over me, without absorbing a single drop of his toxic energy. He had just handed me the absolute perfect setup for the final blow. He had dug his own grave, bragged about the depth of it, and then practically begged me to push him in. I looked at the man who had tormented me for 7 years, and I felt a cold, absolute certainty. It was finally time to show him what real power looked like. A low, rich chuckle rolled from the shattered entryway. It was not a loud sound, but it possessed a specific gravitational pull that instantly silenced Reginald and his frantic screaming. My father, Harrison Caldwell, slowly unbuttoned his custom-tailored suit jacket and stepped fully into the dining room. The heavy soles of his leather shoes crunched against the broken porcelain on the floor, but he moved with the effortless grace of a man who owned every room he ever walked into. As he stepped under the light of the crystal chandelier, the shadows finally left his face. I watched the exact moment the realization hit the most powerful guests in the room. The city councilman, who had been inching toward the hallway, suddenly froze, his eyes widening in pure, unadulterated terror. He stumbled backward, bumping into a serving cart. Next to him, a prominent commercial developer, who had just partnered with Reginald, dropped his crystal glass of bourbon, letting it shatter on the floor. Good Lord, the developer whispered, his voice trembling so violently it echoed in the dead silent room. It is Vanguard. It is the chairman of Vanguard Holdings. The name dropped like a physical bomb into the center of the room. Vanguard Holdings was not just a company. It was the apex predator of the Eastern Seaboard financial markets. It was the invisible hand that funded mayoral campaigns, bought out failing regional banks, and controlled billions in commercial real estate. To the black elite of the city, Vanguard was an untouchable myth, a corporate giant that swallowed competitors whole. The crowd of politicians and socialites immediately parted like the Red Sea scrambling to get out of my father and his way. They pressed their backs against the mahogany walls, desperate to distance themselves from Reginald. They knew that standing too close to a man in Harrison Caldwell and his crosshairs was professional suicide. Reginald stood paralyzed at the head of his dining table. The arrogant posture he had maintained just moments ago collapsed completely. He looked at my father, then looked at the terrified politicians cowering against the walls, and finally, his bloodshot eyes darted toward me. His brain was violently rejecting the truth. He had spent 7 years treating me like a charity case, an uneducated street rat who should be grateful for the crumbs falling from the Vance family table. He could not process that the man he had just threatened to arrest was the ultimate billionaire kingmaker he had spent his entire career trying to emulate. My father stopped walking when he was standing directly in front of Reginald. The physical contrast between them was devastating. Reginald was sweating profusely, his velvet jacket wrinkled, his breathing shallow and panicked. He was the epitome of loud new money, desperate for validation. My father stood perfectly still, projecting the cold, terrifying calm of generational wealth that never needed to announce itself. You invite the city council to your home to eat crab legs and pretend you are the king of this city. Reginald. My father said, his voice smooth and deadly quiet. You boast about your country club memberships and your fake luxury watches to create an illusion of power. Yet you do not even recognize the man who owns the banks that finance your entire pathetic existence. Vivian let out a small strangled gasp from the floor where she was still sitting near Julian. Her manicured hands flew to her mouth as she stared at my father. The woman who had spent the entire evening mocking my natural hair and my unbranded silk dress was currently hyperventilating as she realized she had been insulting the sole heir to a multi-billion-dollar dynasty. Gabrielle shrunk back against the wall, her arrogant sneer entirely wiped away, replaced by the sheer panic of a spoiled child realizing her credit cards were attached to a sinking ship. I warned you to stay out of my house, Reginald stammered, taking a weak step backward, his voice lacking any of its previous thunder. This is a private residence. I do not care if you run Vanguard Holdings. You cannot just walk in here. My father let out another soft chuckle, shaking his head, as he looked at Reginald with profound pity. He reached out and took a thick legal document from the lawyer standing directly behind him. You have spent the last 7 years making my daughter's life a living hell. My father continued, ignoring Reginald and his weak protests. You mocked her because she did not join your elite social clubs. You looked down on her because she preferred to build her own character instead of relying on my checkbook to buy her way into your superficial circles. You let your wife and your daughter treat her like a servant, while you worshipped a white con artist simply because he made you feel validated in the spaces that have always locked you out. Julian, who was still curled on the floor, let out a broken sob, realizing that the woman he had just slapped was not a helpless victim, but a sleeping dragon he had foolishly decided to kick. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a terrifying mixture of regret and absolute fear. He had thrown away a billionaire heiress for a bottle service girl and a $2 million bribe. The mathematical reality of his catastrophic stupidity was actively breaking his mind right there on the hardwood floor. Preston tried to inch his way toward the hallway, using the distraction to escape, but my father and his fixers instantly shifted, blocking his path with their bodies. There was absolutely nowhere to run. I raised my daughter to be humble, but I also raised her to be ruthless, my father said, his voice hardening into steel. She hid her identity because she wanted to see if your son possessed the character to love her for who she was. Instead, he proved to be exactly like you, Reginald, a coward who hides behind a fake empire. Reginald gripped the edge of the dining table, his knuckles turning white. My empire is not fake, he shouted desperately, a bead of sweat dripping off his chin. My company is worth hundreds of millions. I am Reginald Vance. I built this. Your daughter is just a lowly accountant who hacked into my servers. Get her out of my house right now. My father did not raise his voice. He simply looked at Reginald with the absolute chilling certainty of a man holding a loaded gun to his enemy and his head. He unrolled the legal document in his hands and held it up to the light of the chandelier. You are wrong on 2 counts, Reginald. My father declared, his words falling like the final strokes of a guillotine. First, my daughter is not a lowly accountant. Second, This is not your house. The room seemed to stop spinning. The air grew perfectly still. Reginald stared at my father, his mouth opening but producing absolutely no sound. The illusion of the Vance dynasty was completely shattered, leaving them exposed naked and entirely at my mercy. I stepped forward, taking my place right beside my father, ready to deliver the final killing blow. I looked at Reginald, watching his bloodshot eyes dart frantically around the lavish dining room as if the mahogany walls were suddenly closing in on him. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry, rasping sound came out. The absolute certainty in my father and his voice had completely paralyzed him. Vivian, however, could not comprehend the magnitude of the shift in power. She scrambled up from the floor, abandoning her weeping son, and pointed a shaking finger at my father. "What are you talking about?" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the crystal chandelier. "Reginald built this house from the ground up. He bought this land 30 years ago. You cannot just walk in here and claim it is yours because you run some hedge fund. Julian, tell them. Tell them this is our home." Julian did not move. He remained curled on the hardwood floor, weeping into his hands. He was a finance executive, and unlike his mother, he knew exactly what Vanguard Holdings was. My father did not even look at Vivian. He kept his cold, dark eyes locked entirely on Reginald. "My company does not just buy and sell real estate, Reginald." My father said, his tone perfectly level. "We finance the institutions that loan you the money to pretend you are a titan. We own the commercial debt on the skyscrapers you claim to develop." For 3 generations, the Caldwell family has operated in the quiet shadows of the eastern seaboard, building a legacy that does not require flashy country club dinners or fake luxury watches to prove its existence. We are the architects of the financial ecosystem you have been desperately trying to claw your way into. Reginald swallowed hard, his throat clicking audibly in the silent room. "If you are Harrison Caldwell," he stammered, taking a weak step backward, "why is your daughter working as a mid-level accountant? Why did she come to my family with nothing?" I stepped forward, cutting off my father before he could answer. "Because I wanted to know if a man could love me for my character instead of my portfolio," I said, my voice ringing with absolute clarity. "I grew up watching men circle my father like vultures, desperate for a crumb of his influence. When I met your son, I hid my last name and my inheritance because I wanted a partner. I wanted a marriage built on mutual respect and genuine love. I gave Julian a blank canvas. I gave him the opportunity to be a good man to a woman he thought had absolutely nothing to offer but herself." I looked down at Julian, who let out another agonizing sob at my words. "But your son failed the test miserably," I continued. "He did not just fail, he actively punished me for my supposed poverty. He allowed you, Reginald, to treat me like an unwanted stray dog. He allowed Vivian to mock my hair and my clothes. He allowed Gabrielle to flaunt her spoiled existence in my face. And he did it all because stepping on me made him feel powerful. He needed someone to feel superior to, because deep down he knew he was nothing but a mediocre coward, living in his father and his shadow." Vivian suddenly seemed to understand the catastrophic reality of what I was saying. Her aggressive posture completely collapsed. Her eyes widened, and she took a hesitant step toward me, her hands raised in a placating gesture. "Sienna, sweetheart," Vivian said, her voice trembling with a sickeningly sweet fake warmth. "We did not know. You must understand we were just protective of Julian. If you had only told us who your family was, we would have treated you with the respect you deserve. You are a Caldwell. We are all high society here. We can fix this misunderstanding right now." I stared at Vivian, feeling a wave of absolute disgust. "You just proved my exact point, Vivian," I replied, a cold smile touching my lips. "You would have treated me with respect only if you knew I was a billionaire heiress. You do not respect people, Vivian. You only respect power and money. And that is exactly why your son is currently crying on the floor while his pregnant bottle service girl waits in the penthouse he bought with stolen funds." Gabrielle let out a sharp, bitter laugh from her spot on the floor, kicking Preston and his leg as she did. "You threw away a billionaire heiress for a club promoter. Gabrielle spat at her brother, her own life in ruins, but still eager to tear him down. "You are the stupidest man alive, Julian." Reginald desperately shook his head, trying to process the catastrophic revelation. He grabbed the edge of the dining table, his knuckles turning white. "Fine," Reginald growled, his chest heaving. "You are a Caldwell. You are old money. Congratulations on your little social experiment, Sienna. But that does not explain what your father meant. This is my property. The deed is in my name. You cannot simply declare that this house is yours." My father let out a quiet sigh, stepping to the side to give me the floor. "She did not declare anything, Reginald," my father said smoothly. "She executed a legal foreclosure. As I mentioned earlier, she is not a mid-level accountant." I reached out and took the black folder from my father and his corporate lawyer. I held it up, letting the heavy silence stretch across the room before delivering the crushing reality of my actual profession. I am the Senior Director of Distressed Debt Liquidation for Vanguard Holdings. I announced, my words falling like heavy stones onto the Vance family. "I do not balance spreadsheets, Reginald. I evaluate failing corporations. I purchase their toxic debt for pennies on the dollar, and I liquidate their remaining assets to recoup the losses. And as of 4 o'clock this afternoon, your commercial real estate firm was officially classified as a toxic failing asset." Reginald let out a harsh, breathless sound that resembled a dry heave. He gripped the edge of the dining table so tightly that the polished wood groaned under the pressure of his hands. "My firm is backed by First National." He sputtered, his voice devoid of its usual booming resonance. "I have a 30-year relationship with the board of directors there. I play golf with the regional vice president every single Sunday. They would never classify my portfolio as toxic without calling me directly." "You are lying. You have to be lying." I slowly shook my head, offering him a look of absolute clinical detachment. 30 years of golf games and country club handshakes do not override federal banking regulations, Reginald. I pulled a heavily redacted printout from the black folder and held it up to the light of the chandelier. "When Preston drained $15 million from your operational reserves and Julian deliberately cooked the books to hide the missing capital, your firm instantly violated the strict debt covenants written into your master loan agreement." Vivian, who was still kneeling beside her weeping son, looked up with a profound expression of confusion. "Debt covenants?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Reginald, what does she mean? What is a debt covenant?" I did not wait for Reginald to answer his wife. I stepped forward, making sure my voice carried across the silent dining room so every prominent guest could hear the exact mechanics of the Vance family downfall. "It means, Vivian, that your husband's entire empire is built on borrowed money." I explained, my tone perfectly smooth and lethal. "The bank requires him to keep a specific amount of cash on hand at all times to prove he can actually pay his commercial mortgages. When your brilliant venture capitalist son-in-law and your executive son stole that cash, they triggered an automatic default across Reginald's entire portfolio." Reginald's chest heaved, his eyes darting frantically between me and Julian. "If we defaulted, the bank would have notified me," he yelled desperately, trying to find a hole in my logic. "They are legally required to send a notice of default. I never received a single piece of mail regarding a covenant breach." I lowered the document and shifted my gaze to Julian, who was now pressing his forehead against the hardwood floor, actively trying to disappear. "They did send notices, Reginald," I said softly. "They sent 3 certified warning letters over the past month. But Julian was the one managing the internal audits, remember? He intercepted the mail. He buried the default notices in the corporate shredder to protect his $2 million bribe, and to keep you from discovering that he had bought a penthouse for his pregnant mistress." Gabrielle let out a sharp, vicious laugh from her spot on the floor. She pointed a trembling finger at her brother. "You let the bank foreclose on Dad's company to hide your trashy little side piece, you pathetic loser." Julian did not defend himself. He just let out another agonizing groan, gripping his hair with both hands. The reality of his actions was physically crushing him. Reginald staggered backward, pulling at the collar of his shirt as if he were suffocating. The guests in the room were completely silent, watching a titan of industry realize that he had been completely hollowed out from the inside. But the bank cannot just take everything overnight, Reginald reasoned, his voice dropping to a frantic whisper. There is a grace period. There is a restructuring phase. I can refinance. I can find new investors. I smiled, and the coldness of my expression made several politicians standing nearby physically step away from me. You could have refinanced if you had caught the breach 6 months ago, I agreed. But banks hate bad press, Reginald. They hate carrying massive defaulted loans on their public ledgers, especially when it involves high-profile developers who parade around the city pretending to be untouchable. So last week, instead of initiating a highly public and messy foreclosure process, First National decided to quietly package your defaulted loans and auction them off to clear their books. Preston, who had been bleeding quietly against the wall, suddenly spoke up. His voice was raspy, but his arrogant nature simply could not stay quiet. They sell that debt for pennies on the dollar to shadow hedge funds. Preston wheezed, trying to sound like he still understood the financial ecosystem. Those shadow funds take months to process the paperwork. You cannot just walk in here and claim you own the assets, Sienna. I turned to look at Preston, marveling at how a man facing federal prison could still be so confidently incorrect. You are absolutely right, Preston, I said, nodding slowly. Banks do sell distressed debt to shadow hedge funds at a massive discount. In fact, First National sold the entirety of the Vance commercial real estate debt for roughly 30 cents on the dollar. It was the bargain of the century. They sold it to a private, highly aggressive liquidation fund known as Obsidian Capital. Reginald's head snapped up. He recognized the name. Obsidian Capital was notorious in the financial district for executing ruthless lightning-fast asset seizures. I have dealt with Obsidian, he gasped. They are a ghost ship. No one even knows who sits on their executive board. My father, Harrison Caldwell, let out another low, rich chuckle from the doorway. He crossed his arms over his tailored suit, clearly enjoying the absolute destruction I was unleashing. You are looking at the executive board, Reginald. My father said, his voice echoing with terrible finality. Obsidian Capital is a specialized liquidation fund operating exclusively under the Vanguard Holdings umbrella, and my daughter is the sole manager of that fund. The air was completely sucked out of the room. Reginald stared at me, his eyes wide with a terror so profound it looked like his soul was trying to escape his body. I authorized the purchase of your debt, Reginald, I said, stepping right up to the edge of the dining table. I used my own capital to buy every single defaulted loan your company holds. I am not just your daughter-in-law anymore. I am your primary creditor. I own the paper on your office buildings downtown. I own the paper on your commercial retail strips in the suburbs. And because you foolishly cross-collateralized your personal assets to secure that $15 million loan for Preston, I even own the paper on the very walls surrounding us right now. Vivian shook her head violently, refusing to accept the reality. No, she shrieked, her voice breaking. You do not own this house. This is my home. We have lived here for 20 years. You cannot take my home. I looked down at Vivian, noting how the diamond necklace she wore suddenly looked like a very heavy, very expensive collar. I already took it, Vivian, I said smoothly. The grace period expired at exactly 4 o'clock this afternoon. As of right now, you are trespassing on property owned by Obsidian Capital. Reginald dropped to his knees, his legs completely giving out beneath him. The great patriarch of the Vance family, the man who had demanded my submission and mocked my lack of pedigree, was now kneeling in the shattered glass of my wine cup, completely ruined. But I was not finished yet. The financial execution was complete, but the legal consequences were literally just pulling into the driveway. I reached back into the black folder one final time and pulled out a thick stack of stapled papers. I tossed them onto the center of the dining table right next to the remnants of the shattered wine glass. The heavy thud of the paper hitting the wood made Reginald flinch. Those are the finalized foreclosure and asset seizure documents, I said, my voice carrying a quiet, relentless rhythm. I did not just buy the commercial debt, Reginald. When the clock struck 4 today, my team executed the collateral clauses. That means the 3 luxury Mercedes-Benz vehicles currently sitting in your climate-controlled garage belong to me. The offshore accounts you thought were safely hidden belong to me. And this multi-million-dollar estate, right down to the imported silk drapes and the custom Persian rug you are currently bleeding on, legally belongs to my firm. You do not own a single blade of grass on this property anymore. Reginald stared at the stack of papers, his mouth hanging open. He raised a trembling hand, reaching out as if to touch the documents, but his fingers simply hovered in the air, unable to make contact with his own ruin. From the distance, a new sound began to slice through the cool night air. It started as a faint, high-pitched wail, echoing down the winding roads of the exclusive Buckhead neighborhood. Within seconds, the sound multiplied, growing louder and more frantic. Julian lifted his head from the hardwood floor, his tear-streaked face freezing in absolute terror. Preston scrambled backward against the wall, his eyes darting frantically toward the windows. The wailing transformed into a deafening symphony of sirens. The heavy thrum of approaching heavy-duty vehicles shook the foundation of the house. Red and blue lights began to violently flash through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting chaotic sweeping shadows across the terrified faces of the 36 elite guests. The illusion of the untouchable Vance sanctuary was completely annihilated by the harsh strobe lights of law enforcement. Vivian clutched her chest, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "What is that?" she cried out, her voice barely audible over the deafening sirens outside. "Reginald, tell them to stop." I stepped back, standing shoulder to shoulder with my father. "They are not going to stop, Vivian," I said smoothly. "Because yesterday morning, before I even put on this dress, I took a little trip to the regional headquarters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I handed a designated task force every single unredacted forensic audit wire transfer log and encrypted offshore routing number that your brilliant son and your venture capitalist son-in-law generated over the past 2 years. The heavy mahogany front doors, which my father and his corporate fixers had left wide open, were suddenly flooded with armed federal agents. They wore dark tactical windbreakers bearing the bold yellow letters of the FBI and the Securities and Exchange Commission. They moved with a swift, uncompromising authority, swarming the grand foyer and stepping directly into the formal dining room. My father and his men simply stepped aside, parting like the Red Sea to give the federal agents clear access to their targets. A senior agent stepped forward holding a sheaf of warrants. "Nobody move," he commanded, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "We have federal arrest warrants for Preston Hayes and Julian Vance." Preston did not hesitate. The cowardly grifter let out a panicked shout and lunged toward the swinging doors that led to the kitchen, desperately hoping to find a back exit through the servant quarters. He did not even make it 3 steps. 2 federal agents tackled him violently, slamming his expensive tailored suit directly into the custom floral wallpaper. The impact rattled the framed family portraits hanging on the wall. Preston thrashed wildly against the agents, screaming about his rights and demanding to call his lawyer. "Get off me!" he yelled, his voice cracking in sheer panic. "I am a legitimate investor. You have the wrong man. Gabrielle, call my attorney. Call him right now." But Gabrielle just backed away, pressing herself against the dining table. She looked at her husband as he was shoved face first onto the hardwood floor, her expression twisting from shock into absolute revulsion. She watched the agents roughly pull Preston and his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs snapping shut echoed loudly over his pathetic protests. Across the room, another pair of agents approached Julian. Vivian threw herself over her son, sobbing hysterically and waving her manicured hands at the federal officers. "Do not touch him!" Vivian shrieked, her designer gown dragging through the spilled wine on the floor. "He is a financial executive. He is a Vance. You cannot treat him like a common street criminal. He was just trying to save his father and his company." The agents ignored her frantic screaming. They gently but firmly moved Vivian aside, peeling her away from her golden boy. Julian did not fight back. He did not run. He simply knelt on the floor, looking completely hollowed out and dead inside. He offered his wrists to the agents without a single word of protest. The heavy steel cuffs locked around his wrists, sealing his catastrophic downfall. The federal agents hauled Julian to his feet. He could not look at me. He could not look at his mother, who was wailing on the floor. He stared blankly ahead as the agents turned him around and began the long, humiliating march out of the dining room. The 36 prominent guests, the politicians, the real estate developers, and the fraternity brothers, parted to let the agents pass. They actively turned their backs, refusing to make eye contact with the criminals being paraded through their midst. The local city councilman, who had eaten Reginald and his food all evening, was already whispering frantically to his chief of staff, ordering him to erase every photograph and campaign donation linked to the Vance family. It was a brutal display of high society self-preservation. The fake empire was burning to the ground, and the rats were fleeing the ship. They watched in disgusted silence as Julian and Preston were dragged out the front doors, pushed down the marble steps, and shoved roughly into the back of the waiting federal cruisers. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the utter devastation of the dining room. The criminal elements had been purged, but the financial and emotional ruin of the remaining Vance family members was just settling into the cold air. Reginald remained on his knees in the shattered glass, staring at the empty doorway where his only son had just been led away in chains. He had lost his legacy, his fortune, and his heir in the span of 30 minutes. But I was not quite finished. I had one final piece of business to conclude before I walked out of their lives forever. The red and blue lights of the federal cruisers faded down the long, winding driveway, taking the last remnants of the Vance family dignity with them into the dark night. The grand dining room, once a glowing symbol of elite black excellence and insurmountable wealth, was now a battlefield of shattered crystal-crushed velvet and absolute financial ruin. The 36 prominent guests had vanished into the night, like ghosts fleeing a burning building, leaving only the deafening silence of a destroyed dynasty in their wake. I stood perfectly still next to my father, watching Reginald struggling to breathe amidst the broken porcelain and spilled food. The great patriarch, who had commanded boardrooms and bullied local politicians, was currently crawling on his hands and knees, his custom-tailored velvet suit soaked in dark red wine. He was gasping for air, his chest heaving violently, as the catastrophic reality of his situation crushed the remaining oxygen from his lungs. He had lost his only son to a federal indictment, his entire commercial real estate empire to a shadow hedge fund, and his multi-million-dollar estate to the very woman he had called a ghetto rat just an hour earlier. He was a king without a kingdom, a tyrant who had finally been swallowed whole by his own massive ego and his desperate need for white validation. Vivian and Gabrielle were huddled near the far corner of the room, staring blankly at the empty doorway where their husbands had just been dragged away in handcuffs. The illusion of their untouchable wealth had evaporated entirely, leaving them completely exposed to the harsh, brutal truth of their new reality. They had no offshore accounts to fall back on. They had no hidden trust funds or emergency safety nets. Because Julian and Preston had drained absolutely everything to fund their secret lives and fraudulent Ponzi schemes, the Vance women were quite literally penniless. The designer gowns they were currently wearing and the jewelry around their necks were likely the only valuable assets they still legally possessed. Vivian slowly turned her head and looked at me. The venom and arrogant superiority that had defined her entire existence for the past 7 years were completely gone. They were replaced by a desperate, frantic terror that widened her eyes and made her entire body shake. She realized that the woman standing in front of her was no longer the submissive daughter-in-law she could endlessly torture without consequence. I was the senior director of distressed debt liquidation for Vanguard Holdings, and I held the legal deed to the very floorboards she was kneeling on. "Sienna, please, Vivian," whimpered, her voice cracking as she scrambled across the ruined dining room floor. She did not even care about the broken glass cutting into her expensive dress or the wine staining her skin. She crawled directly toward me, reaching out with trembling, manicured hands. Gabrielle followed her mother, her face smeared with ruined makeup, completely abandoning her golden child persona as the terrifying specter of absolute poverty loomed over her. They threw themselves at my feet in a display of pathetic desperation. Vivian grabbed my ankles, her fingers digging into the silk fabric of my dress, while Gabrielle clutched at my knees, sobbing hysterically into my legs. "Please do not do this to us," Vivian begged, her voice rising into a frantic shriek that echoed off the mahogany walls. "You cannot throw us out on the street, Sienna. Where will we go? We have absolutely nothing left. Reginald is sick. Julian is gone. You won this round. You proved your point, but you cannot just leave us with nothing. We are still your family. We are still your blood by marriage. Please show us some mercy." Gabrielle wept violently, pressing her wet face against my legs. "I am sorry," she choked out, her voice muffled by her own tears. "I am so sorry for everything I said to you tonight, and every day before this. I was just jealous of you. I was stupid and arrogant. Please, Sienna, do not take my home away. I will do anything you want. I will apologize publicly to everyone. Just let us stay here." I looked down at the two women groveling in the spilled wine and shattered glass. For 7 long years I had endured their relentless psychological abuse. I had swallowed their insults about my natural hair, my modest background, and my supposed lack of ambition. I had let them make me feel small because I believed my silence would eventually earn their respect. I had waited for them to show me a single ounce of genuine kindness or acceptance, but they only respected power, and they only begged for mercy when the barrel of a financial gun was pressed directly against their foreheads. I did not feel a single shred of pity for them. They were not crying because they regretted their cruelty or their complicity in Julian and his betrayal. They were crying because they were about to lose their country club memberships and their luxury vehicles. They were mourning their status, not their family. I reached down with my right hand and slowly gripped the heavy diamond wedding ring on my left ring finger. The diamond had been selected by Julian, a flashy, expensive stone meant to showcase his wealth rather than symbolize any actual emotional union between us. I slid the cold metal over my knuckle and held it suspended in the air above them. I looked Vivian directly in her terrified, tear-filled eyes. This family always taught me that I needed to learn my place in high society. I said, my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of any human warmth. "You spent 7 years reminding me of my position, making sure I knew exactly how low I ranked in your ecosystem. I just wanted to thank you for those lessons, Vivian, because I finally know exactly where my place is." I opened my fingers and let the heavy diamond ring drop. It fell through the air and landed with a sharp metallic clink directly into a dark puddle of spilled red wine, staining the floorboards beneath Vivian and her trembling hands. "My place is now your creditor." I continued, my words falling with absolute finality. "Your accounts are frozen. Your assets are seized. You have exactly 2 hours to gather whatever cheap personal items you can carry and vacate my property before I have my private security contractors physically remove you from the premises. Do not leave a mess on your way out." I did not wait for her response or stick around to watch them scramble. The wailing of the two broken women echoed behind me, but it was just meaningless white noise now. I turned my back on the Vance family and held out my hand. My father, Harrison Caldwell, offered a proud, satisfied smile and wrapped his strong, protective arm around mine. Together we walked out of the grand dining room, leaving the wreckage of the fake empire entirely behind us. We stepped through the shattered mahogany front doors and out into the cool, refreshing night air. The heavy armored SUV was waiting for us at the base of the marble steps, its engine purring with quiet, limitless power. As the driver opened the heavy ballistic door for me, I stepped inside, settling into the plush leather seat. I did not look back at the mansion. I did not look back at the flashing blue lights of the remaining police cruisers or the crushed tulips on the front lawn. I simply watched the iron gates of the estate close behind us, sealing the tomb of the family who had foolishly tried to bury me without realizing I was the very earth they were standing on. The most profound lesson we can learn from this ordeal is that true security never comes from conforming to the expectations of those who do not value you. When you build your life around seeking validation from people who are committed to misunderstanding you, you hand them the power to destroy your peace. The ultimate reclamation of power happens when you realize that their rejection is not a reflection of your worth, but a profound revelation of their limitations. Family is not determined by blood or proximity, it is forged by mutual respect, unwavering support, and the courage to show up when it matters most. You cannot heal in the same environment that broke you, and sometimes the only way to find your true place in the world is to walk away from the table where you were never meant to sit. Have you ever had to establish boundaries with a toxic family member or rebuild your life after a devastating betrayal? Share your journey of resilience in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories about claiming your power and defining success on your own terms.